You know, might look good if we both have the same one. Hi,
Hello,
how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good deal. So I put the James Potter background and I thought
Yep,
you because we usually have it in the middle.
yep.
Now you don't have to worry about that. So it's just already here. Yeah, I like that. Good color. Okay.
It's a very good color, yes. Did you just Google search the image?
I did. Yeah.
Was yours the Gumroad image as well?
I think so. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's the one that I saved. We'll have
yeah.
to ping,
Me
we'll
too.
have to say go to Gumroad and get the
Mm.
books, the
Link in
audio.
description down below.
Yeah, exactly. All right, are you ready to read?
Yes, I am. Come on, I've had the page ready. Took too fast.
We might get some Madame Delacroix language in here today, so you get that one.
Oh, really? Okay.
I'm the
We'll see.
one,
I'll see.
I'm the one that's 100 miles from New Orleans, but you get that one.
Chapter 6, Harry's Midnight Meeting.
We're back to Harry again.
Back to Harry. Yeah. Um,
He's a big boy now.
yes, he is. He's all grown up. Um, James hurried back to the Gryffindor common room after classes, shrugging out of his school robes as he ran up the steps. He changed into a jacket and an evening cloak, matted his hair down with water from the basin, frowned critically at himself in the mirror, and then ran back down the steps two at a time to meet his dad.
Pause, because I just have to throw in a little trivia. Did you know that one of Harry's and James's ancestors is the one who made the Sleek Easy potion? Okay,
Yep.
so that's what mats your hair down, which I think is hilarious because it talks about Harry and James both having like wild hair that they can't ever control, but their fortune came from the Sleek Easy potion. And so,
Did you
like,
know that in um, uh, Goblet of Fire, that is the very same potion that Hermione uses to tame her hair.
oh yeah, they do mention that. That's too funny.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Um, and I think they're also in one of their ancestors also was the inventor of Skelegro.
Really?
I
Oh
think.
wow.
Don't quote me on that. I'm possibly very wrong there, but I know their family was like the Sleek Easy head potion was the big one, but they also had other ones. I
Hmm.
think Skelegro and the Pepper Up potion was one of them, because
Wow. Creative
Harry's
bunch.
Harry's ancestor, I can't remember his name. Um,
You had an
he
ancestor named Harry.
he was known as the Potter because he would pot around his property and make potions to heal Muggles.
Hmm.
Um, and that the granddaughter of the second brother of the third brother, sorry,
Mhm.
from the third brother married into the Potter family,
Huh.
and that's where Harry's lineage comes from. I think I'll just start again. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, that'll work.
Okay. Chapter 6, Harry's Midnight Meeting. James hurried back to the Gryffindor common room after classes, shrugging out of his school robes as he ran up the steps. He changed into a jacket and an evening cloak, matted his hair down with water from the basin, frowned critically at himself in the mirror, and then ran back down the steps two at a time to meet his dad. Harry was waiting with Neville by the portrait of Sir Cadogan. A spirited tussle it was, Cadogan was saying, leaning nonchalantly against the frame of his painting and waving his sword illustriously. He was talking to Neville, who looked extremely uncomfortable. I saw the whole thing, of course. Took place right here. Bollocks Humphreys was his name, and he fought like a man possessed. Lost, of course, but noble as 1,000 kings. Spilt most of his innards right here where you're standing, and still swung his sword with more strength than a mountain troll. Gallant man. gallant. Ah, James, here we are, Neville said loudly as James approached. Harry and Sir Cadogan looked up. Harry smiled, looking his son up and down. Your mum will be glad to know you're putting that cloak to use. To be honest, this is the first time I've had it out of the trunk, James admitted, grinning sheepishly. Harry nodded. And it'll go right back into the trunk after tonight, won't it? Guaranteed. Good man, Harry acknowledged. James
Nice.
fell into step next to his dad as they headed toward the staircase. Wait! Cadogan cried, sheathing his sword and jumping into the center of his frame. Have I ever told you about the Battle of the Red Mages? Bloodiest massacre these walls have ever seen. Happened just at the foot of those stairs. Next time then, courage! Who's that? James asked, looking back over his shoulder. You'll get to know him, Neville said. Enjoy your ignorance while you can. As they walked, James listened to his dad as his dad told Neville about the current happenings at the Ministry. There had been an arrest of several individuals involved in a counterfeit portkey operation. More trolls were being seen in the foothills, and the Ministry was stepping up patrols to keep the troublesome idiots from venturing into Muggle territories. The new minister, Loquacious Nap, was prepping to give a speech on expanded trade with Asian wizarding communities, including lifting the ban on flying carpets and something called shades. In other words, Harry said, sighing, things are more or less the way they always are. Little breakouts here and there, small conspiracies and squabbles, politics and paperwork. What you mean?
I was just going to say, I love how George Norman Lippert brings in international things. Like I feel like Harry Potter was very much, centralized at Hogwarts. And they had a little bit, with Durmstrang and Beauxbaton, they had a little bit of that. But mostly it was just Hogwarts. And so it's really neat to me for a fan fiction to take it outside those walls and really not only just hint at it, but really talk about, lifting the ban on flying carpets, like actually culture specific and things like that. I think it's really, really cool.
That's also a nod to the Harry Potter books as well. There's a spot in that where Arthur is having a discussion about someone wanting to bring in flying carpets, but Mr. Weasley won't allow it because carpets are classified as a Muggle artifact.
Oh, gotcha. Interesting. Okay.
So it's a little nod back. Hey, this is still going on all these years later.
Right. I love that. The connections are amazing.
In other words, Harry said, sighing, things are more or less the way they always are. Little breakouts here and there, small conspiracies and squabbles, politics and paperwork. What you mean, Neville said, smiling quickly, is that peace can be a pretty boring thing for an aura. Harry grinned. I guess you're right. I should be thankful my job isn't any more interesting, shouldn't I? At least I get to spend some nights at home with Ginny, Lil, and Albus. He glanced down at James. And take on an ambassador's assignment that just happens to afford me the chance to see my boy during his first week at Hogwarts.
I can't believe it's only been a week.
I know. It's crazy. I understand he's only been to McGonagall's office once so far, Neville commented mildly. Oh, Harry said, still eyeing James. And what for? Neville raised his eyebrows at James as if to say, you have the floor. I broke a window. Harry smiled hardened a bit around the edges. I look forward to the story of how that happened, he said thoughtfully. James felt his dad stare like it was a set of tiny weights. They reached a double doorway with both doors thrown wide open. Delicious smells wafted down the hall. "Here we are," Neville said, standing aside to allow Harry and James to enter first. The American quarters during their stay. We've given them most of the southwest turret, had it temporarily refitted with a recreational area, common room, kitchen, and staff to suit their needs. I love magic.
We definitely need a recreational area. That was a good idea.
Absolutely. Sounds nice, Harry said, examining the space. The common room was, in fact, rather small, with circular walls, high, rough-beamed ceilings, a cramped stone fireplace, and only two very tall, narrow windows. Excuse me. The Americans had, however, been very busy. There were bearskin rugs on the floor and tall, vibrantly colored tapestries hung on the walls, positioned over the stone staircase that spiraled the room. A three-story bookcase was crammed with gigantic volumes, most accessible only via a very rickety-looking wheeled ladder. The most amazing detail, however, was a mind-bogglingly complex armature of brass gears, joints, and mirrored lenses that hung from the ceiling, filling the upper chamber of the room and moving very slowly. James stared up into it, delighted and amazed. It made a very faint squeaking and clicking as it moved. "You've discovered my daylight savings device, my boy," Ben Franklin said, coming from a large arched doorway beneath the spiral staircase. "One of my absolute necessities whenever I travel for a long period. Despite the fact that it's variable, bare to pack, and the calibrations when I set it up again are simply dreadful." "It's wonderful," Neville said, also staring up into the slowly ratcheting network of mirrors and wheels. "What does it do?" "Let me demonstrate," Franklin said eagerly. "It works best in full daylight, of course, but even the stars and moons have a bright night can provide adequate light. An evening such as this should prove most satisfactory. Let me see." He moved to a battered, high-backed leather chair, settled himself into it carefully, and then consulted a chart on the wall. 3rd of September, yes. Moon is in the 4th house. It is, let me see, approximately 7:15. Jupiter is approaching the final leg of... As Franklin muttered, he produced his wand and began pointing it at bits of the device. Gears began to spin as parts of the device whirred to life. Bits of the armature unfolded as other bits pivoted, making room. Mirrors began to slide, positioning behind cycling groups of lenses, which magnified them. Ratchets clicked and shuttled. The entire device seemed to dance slowly within itself as Franklin directed it with his wand, apparently making calculations in his head as he went. And as it moved, something began to form within it. Ghostly beams of rose-colored light began to appear between the mirrors, pencil-thin, turning motes of dust into tiny specks of fire. There were dozens of them, of the beams, brightening, swiveling into place, and eventually forming a complicated geometric tracery. And then, in the center of the tracery, shapes shimmered into place. James turned on the spot, watching rapidly as tiny planets coalesced, formed out of colored light. They spun and orbited, tracing faint arcs behind them. Two larger shapes condensed in the very center, and James recognized them as the sun and the moon. The sun was a ball of rose light, its corona spreading several feet around it. The moon, smaller but more solid, was like a silver quaffle, equally divided between its light and dark sides. Turning slowly, the entire constellation weaved and turned majestically, dramatically lighting the brass device and spilling delightful patterns of light over the entire room. Nothing so healthy as natural light, Franklin said. Captured here through the windows and then condensed within a carefully calibrated network of mirrors and lenses, as you can see. The light is filtered with my own optical spellwork for clarity. The final result is, well, what you see here. Excellent for the eyesight, the blood, and one's health overall, obviously. This is the secret to your longevity, Harry asked rather breathlessly. Oh, certainly this is a small part of it, Franklin said dismissively. Mostly, I just prefer it to read by at night. Certainly it's more fun than a torch. He caught James's eye and winked. Professor Jackson approached the archway. James saw him glance from Franklin to the light display overhead, a look of tired disdain on his face. Dinner, I am told, is served. Shall we adjourn to the dining room, or shall I have it brought in here? Along with Harry, James, Neville, and the representatives from the ministry, most of the Hogwarts teaching staff was present, including Professor Curry. To James's consternation, Curry told Harry all about James's skills on the football field, assuring him that she would work to see that said skills were developed to their fullest extent.
So I just have to say that as a Curry myself, listening to them talk about Professor Curry cracks me up because I feel like that would be my exact job. Like I would be, as a Libra for sure, I would be the one like, Muggles and wizards, we need to get along. And why don't we play a game that Muggles would play so we can understand how Muggles feel? Like that would totally be my job. I would definitely teach Muggle studies. So just have to put that out there. Thank you, George, for thinking of me when you wrote this book and put me in
there. Contrary to his dad's suspicion, the meal was remarkably diverse and enjoyable. Madame Delacroix's gumbo was the first course. She carried it to the table herself, somehow not spilling a drop despite her blindness. Even more curiously, she directed the ladle with her wand, a gnarled and evil-looking length of grapefruit, dishing a portion into each bowl at the table while she stared at the ceiling and hummed rather disconcertingly. The gumbo was indeed spicy, thick chunks of shrimp and sausage, but James liked it. Next came fresh rolls and several varieties of butter, including a browned and sticky goo that Jackson identified as apple butter. James tasted it carefully on a hunk of bread and then spread a gigantic dollop on the remainder of his roll. The main course was rack of lamb with mint jelly. James didn't consider this typical American food and commented as much. There's no such thing as American food, James, Jackson said. Our cuisine, like our people, is simply the sum total of the various world cultures we come from. That's not entirely true, Franklin interjected. I am pretty sure we can lay undisputed claim to the spicy buffalo wing. Will we be having those tonight? James asked hopefully. My apologies, Franklin said. It is rather difficult to collect the ingredients for such things unless you possess Madame Delacroix's unique voodoo capabilities. Is that so? Neville inquired, helping himself to more mint jelly. And what abilities are those, madam? Madame Delacroix composed herself, having given Professor Franklin a wilting, albeit blind, glare. The old man, he don't know what he speaks of. I just know about the sources he not as familiar with, being more interested in his machines and gizmos. Franklin's smile for the first time seemed icy. Madame Delacroix is being modest. She is, you may already know, one of our country's foremost experts on remote physio apparition. Do you know what that is, James? James didn't have the slightest idea, and yet something about the milky gaze of Madame Delacroix made him reluctant to say so. Franklin was watching him earnestly, expecting a response. Finally, James shook his head before Franklin could explain. However, Harry spoke up. It just means that the madam here, has, let's say, different means of getting around. Different means is one way to put it, Franklin chuckled. James felt uneasy hearing that chuckle. There was something nasty in it. He noticed that Franklin was emptying what was likely his third glass of wine. Think about it, James. Remote physio apparition. Can you factor it out? It means that poor old blind Madame Delacroix can project herself, send a version of herself out into the wide world, collect things, and even bring them back. And the beauty of it is the version of herself she can project isn't poor or old or blind. Isn't that right, madame? Delacroix stared blindly at the spot just over Franklin's shoulder, her face a grim mask of anger. Then she smiled, and as James had seen on the day of the American's arrival, the smile transformed her face. Oh, dear Professor Franklin, you do tell such tales, she said, and her strange Bayou accent seemed even thicker than usual. My skills were never as grand as you speak of, and they're far less now that I'm the old woman ye see before ye. If I could project such a light, I hardly think I'd ever let anyone see me as I really am. The tension in the room broke, and there was laughter. Franklin smiled a bit tightly, but let the moment pass. After dessert, Harry, James, and the rest of the Hortians retired to the common room again, where Franklin's daylight savings device had reproduced and condensed a shimmering version of the Milky Way. It lit the room with a silvery glow that James thought he could very nearly feel on his skin. James offered the adults, sorry, Jackson offered the adults an after-dinner cocktail in tiny glasses. Neville barely.
Oh, you can finish your sentence before I interrupt.
Neville barely touched his. Both Miss Saccharina and Mr. Recreant sampled tiny sips and gave forced, rather strange smiles. Harry, after holding it up to the light to look through the amber liquid, downed his in one gulp. He squinted and shook his head, then looked inquiringly at Jackson, unable to speak. Just a little of Tennessee's finest, with a little wizard afterburn thrown in, Jackson explained.
Tennessee whiskey, baby.
Jack Daniels.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think it's really funny. I'm just realizing Franklin's daylight savings device, saving his own daylight, like helping him stay alive. Daylight savings.
Daylight savings.
Ding. Yep. Okay. Just had to mention that.
I'm pretty sure in real life, Franklin was one who came up with the idea of daylight savings.
Really? Oh, that's Google.
I think, don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
Google it first.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to Google that. We're gonna have a trivia on our own trivia.
Exactly. Finally, Harry thanked the Americans and bid them good night. Retracing their steps through the darkened corridors, Harry walked with his hand on James's shoulder. Want to stay with me in the guest quarters, James? Harry asked. I can't guarantee I'll be able to see you much after tonight. I'll be busy all day tomorrow, meeting with the Americans, keeping our friends from the Department of Ambassadorial Relations from making an international incident of themselves. Then I'm off home again. What do you say? Sure, James agreed instantly. Where are your quarters? Harry smiled. Watch this, he said quietly, stomping in the middle of the hall. He turned around and paced idly, looking thoughtfully up at the dim ceiling. I need a really cool room with a couple of beds for me and my boy to sleep in tonight. James stared at his dad quizzically. Several seconds went by as Harry continued to pace back and forth. He seemed to be waiting for something. James was about to ask him what he was up to when he heard a sudden noise. A low grind and rumble came from the wall behind him. James turned around just in time to see the stonework alter and shift, reforming itself around a huge door that hadn't been there a moment before. Harry glanced down at his son, smiled knowingly, then reached and opened the door. Inside was a large apartment complete with a set of draped bunk beds, framed Gryffindor posters on the wall, a wardrobe containing Harry's trunk and James's school robes, and a fully equipped washroom. James stood inside the door, opening and closing his mouth, speechless. The room of requirements, Harry explained, flopping onto a low, overstuffed chair. I can't believe I never told you about it. James got ready for bed, but his dad simply changed into a pair of jeans and a sweater and freshened up at the basin. I need to go out for a little while, he told James. After dinner tonight, Professor Franklin asked me to meet him privately. He wanted some time to discuss a few things outside of tomorrow's official meeting. There was something about the way Harry said this that told James his dad preferred a private chat over an official meeting anyway. I shouldn't be too long, and I'll be just down the hall in the Americans' quarters. Breakfast tomorrow, you and me. James nodded happily. He still hadn't brought himself to tell his dad about his abysmal failure on the Quidditch pitch, and he was happy to put it off for as long as possible. When Harry was gone, James lay in the top bunk, thinking about the events of the night. He remembered the sudden nastiness of Franklin, which had surprised him. It was almost as great a change in character as the change that came over the voodoo queen, Madame Delacroix, when she smiled. Thinking of Madame Delacroix reminded James of the way she spooned the gumbo, unseeingly operating the ladle with her creepy black wand, never spilling a drop. James realized he was simply too excited to sleep. He slid off the top bunk and prowled the room restlessly. His dad's trunk sat open in the bottom of the wardrobe. James looked into it idly, then stopped and looked closer. He knew what it was when he saw it, but he was surprised his dad would have brought it along. What use would he have for it here? James considered it. Finally, he reached into the trunk and withdrew his dad's invisibility cloak, unfolding its smooth, heavy length as it came. How many times had the young Harry Potter explored the grounds of Hogwarts, safely hidden away under this cloak? James had heard enough tales from both his dad, Uncle Ron, and Aunt Hermione to know this was an opportunity not to be missed. But where to go? James thought for a moment and then smiled a long, mischievous smile. He slipped the cloak over his head, just the way he used to on the rare occasions when Harry would let him play with it. James vanished. A moment later, the door of the room of requirement seemed to open all by itself, rocking slowly on its huge hinges. After a pause, it shut again, carefully and silently. Tiptoeing, James headed for the quarters of the representatives of Arma Aleron.
I love it. I love that Harry's first night at Hogwarts, of course he has to go wandering the halls at night. I mean, it's Harry.
Obviously.
Obviously. All right. So I get to be James walking down the corridors. Okay.
Yes, you do.
All right. Let's see. Okay. James had only gotten halfway down the corridor when there was a flicker of motion. Mrs. Norris, Filch's awful cat, had darted across the passage that intersected the corridor 20 feet ahead. James stopped, his breath caught in his chest. Shouldn't you be dead by now, you ratty old carpet sample? He whispered to himself, cursing his luck. Then, worse, Filch's voice came echoing down the passage. That's it, dearest, he said in a sing-song voice. Don't let the little buggers escape. Teach them a lesson that will have their little mouseykin shivering with fear. Filch's shadow leaked across the floor of the intersection, weaving as he approached. James knew he was invisible, but he couldn't help feeling that he should hunker up against the wall. He sidled into a narrow space between a doorway and a suit of armor, trying to keep his breathing shallow and silent. He peered around the elbow of the suit of armor. Filch stepped into the intersection, his gait rather unsteady. Find a hidey hole, did they, precious? He asked the unseen Mrs. Norris. He reached into his coat and produced a silver flask. He took a swig, wiped his mouth with his sleeve, and then spun the cap back on. There they are, coming this way again, my dear. Come, come. Two mice scurried into the intersection, looping and dodging as they approached Filch's feet. Mrs. Norris pounced, batting at them, but the mice scampered away, darting along the wall toward where James was hiding. Mrs. Norris followed, growling. To James's great chagrin, the mice scampered behind the suit of armor and wriggled under the edge of the invisibility cloak. Their cold little feet scurried over James's bare toes, then they stopped between his feet, sniffing the air as if sensing a hiding place. James tried to push them out from under the cloak with his toes, but they refused to go. Mrs. Norris patted down the corridor intently, her whiskers twitching. She hunkered along the front of the suit of armor's base, one paw outstretched, then pounced around it, stopping inches from the edge of the invisibility cloak. She looked around, her eyes flashing, sensing the mice were nearby, but not seeing them. Ooh, I can imagine being stuck with a cloak around me, and I can't move, and there's mice scampering around my feet. No, thank you.
Could be worse.
Yeah, true, but
It could be spiders crawling around your feet.
oh, that's definitely worse. Don't tell me those dumb animals have bested you, my dear, Filch said, scuffling down the corridor toward them. James watched Mrs. Norris. She had encountered the invisibility cloak before, years earlier. James knew the stories, having been told them by both Aunt Hermione and Uncle Ron. Maybe she remembered the smell of it, or maybe she was sensing James himself, his heat, or scent of the beat of his heart. She raised her eyes, narrowing them, as if she knew he was there and was trying very hard to see him. Don't be a sore loser, my dear Mrs. Norris, Filch said, coming closer still. He was almost near enough that if he reached out, he might inadvertently touch James. If they got away, they'll just tell their rodent friends about you. It's a victory either way you slice it. He's so drunk. Mrs. Norris inched closer. Yeah. Mrs. Norris inched closer. The mice between James's feet were getting nervous. They tried to hide under each other, scooting further back between James's feet. Mrs. Norris raised a paw. To James's horror, she brushed the edge of the invisibility cloak with it. She hissed. The mice, hearing the hiss, panicked. They scampered out from under the cloak, darting right between Mrs. Norris's feet. She jumped at the sight of them, ducking to watch them scurry away into the corridor. Filch laughed raspily. Ooh, that's a hard sentence to say. Filch laughed raspily. They put the spook on you, precious. I'd never have expected it. There they go. After them now. But Mrs. Norris half turned back toward James. Her baleful orange eyes narrowed. Her slit pupils flared wide. She raised her paw again. Go, Mrs. Norris, go, Filch said, his mood swinging to annoyance. He shoved her with his foot, scooching her away from James and toward the mice, which had disappeared further along the corridor. Filch's foot caught the edge of the cloak, pulling it away from James's feet. He felt cool air on his toes. Mrs. Norris looked back toward James and hissed again. Filch, however, was too sodden to take heed. They went that way, you blind old thing. I'd have never guessed a pair of dumb animals would get to jump on you. Let's go, let's go. There's always more near the kitchens. Ew. He rambled on into the shadows of the corridor, and eventually Mrs. Norris followed, throwing occasional wrinkled glances back toward James. When they turned the corner, he exhaled shakily. composed himself, then continued down the corridor, running lightly and feeling extremely lucky. You know what's interesting?
Mm-hmm.
I said, you know what's interesting? One time when Harry was out under the cloak, he also ran into a rat, but it was a very bad rat. And he didn't see it. He just saw a name on the Marauders map.
That was in the movie only. That wasn't in the book.
Well, I'll count that one. The movie got a couple things that were cool.
Oh yeah, yeah. Especially when it comes to the Marauders map, and you might know the scene I'm talking about. The little, what the hell's going on here thing.
Oh, wait. Okay, we got to talk about that later.
Put a pin in. I'll show you later.
Okay, sounds good. When he reached the door to the Americans' quarters, it was closed and bolted. In the darkness, James could hear the voices of his dad and Franklin inside, but they were muffled and unintelligible. He was about to give up and head downstairs, thinking he might perhaps find Cedric's ghost again, or even the Muggle intruder, when the voices inside the door grew louder. The bolt socked back, and James scrambled out of the way, forgetting for a moment that he was hidden under the cloak. He pressed himself against the wall on the opposite side of the corridor just as the door creaked open. Franklin emerged first, talking quietly. Harry followed, closing the door with the practiced stealth of any good auror. Practice being quiet when you don't need to, Harry had told his son on many occasions, and you won't need to think about it when you do. I find it safer to move around during a private conversation, Franklin was saying. Even our own quarters are subject to eavesdropping by those whose philosophies differ from my own. At least this way, no unwanted ears can hear the entirety of our dialogue. Funny thing, Harry said. I spent so much time sneaking around these halls and corridors when I was a student that even as an adult, it's difficult to avoid the instinct to skulk and sneak for fear that I might get caught and be given detention.
And she would.
Yes, she would. She'd still give him.
Oh yeah, she'd still give him detention. I don't care. Detention.
The two men began to walk slowly, apparently meandering in no particular direction. James followed at a safe distance, taking care not to breathe too heavily or stumble against any of the statues or suits of armor that lined the walls. Things haven't changed much, you know, Franklin said. Now, however, we have worse things than detention to worry about. I don't know, Harry said, and James could hear the wry smile in his voice. I had some pretty horrible detentions. Yeah, he did. Franklin murmured noncommittally. The history of both our schools has involved some unsavory characters and unnecessary ugliness. Your Miss Umbridge, our Professor Magnuson. Your Voldemort, our... Well, honestly, we have no one in our history that compares to him. Indeed, he was a terrible threat to all of us while he lived. Our duty is to ensure that such things don't happen again. Am I to assume that this meeting, then, is an opportunity to compare notes about such threats? Off the record, so to speak? Harry asked seriously. Franklin sighed. One can never have too many friends or too many sources, Mr. Potter. I am not an auror, and I do not have any official authority or policing jurisdiction, even in my own country. I am just an old teacher. Old teachers, however, are often underestimated, as you certainly know. Old teachers see quite a lot. You have your own version of the progressive element at, I remember how to say this, Alma Alaron. Oh, it's beyond that, unfortunately. For most of the students and even the staff, the facts of Voldemort and his Death Eaters are up for conjecture. It's incredible how short a time must pass before a certain kind of mentality feels it is safe to turn history onto its head. Speaking of that, we just passed the anniversary of the Holocaust, and that was one thing that I can't remember which president it was, but it was a U.S. president that said, we must get photos of what's going on over there because there's going to come a time when people don't believe it. And they say it never happened. And so that's why you see so many photos of Auschwitz and a lot of that.
Mm.
And there was and I saw a thing yesterday that there's like 60% of young people today don't know what the Holocaust is. And so it's like,
Yeah.
we need to make sure this never happens again. And I think the hashtag that goes along with it is never again, hashtag never again. And so that's what it made me think of when he's like, okay, Voldemort and his Death Eaters are up for conjecture. Like, some people are like, maybe it never happened. And, ooh, that's scary to think about. Like something
Yeah,
that
exactly.
terrible.
Well,
Because
think about the Holocaust. What anniversary are we at with the Holocaust?
I don't know if it was an anniversary or if it was because it didn't really have a date. It was more of a
Yeah.
history, like a national day of remembrance kind of thing.
Yeah. Like, you think about it, there's going to be a time where eventually there's going to be no one living who remembers the atrocities of the Holocaust or any such tragedy. Enough time passes, and unless there is a official record of it somewhere, it's just going to be lost to history.
Right, right. So yeah, I'm glad that
You know?
they were able to get photos at the time.
Now, if the young people from today don't know it, then when those young people, well, some of those young people become teachers, how are they going to teach stuff that they don't know?
Hmm. Yeah. So it's interesting that's what came to mind thinking about the progressive element, and they're trying to say question the victors, and is history really what they say it is, kind of thing.
You
Seems
see this today as well. Did you see the article about conspiracy theory that the Titanic didn't actually sink?
really.
Yeah, they're trying to say it was actually another ship that sank that looks like the Titanic, but the Titanic didn't actually sink. It's all a big scam to try and get people out of,
Wow.
you know,
Good
all
grief.
those people are just, off living tax free on some uncharted island or something like that.
Oh, wow. Well, I guess I should keep reading. But yeah,
Probably, yeah. Let's get back to the story.
interesting conversation though. I appreciate it. Okay, let's see. I'll start back with that line. Oh, it's beyond that, unfortunately. For most of the students and even the staff, the facts of Voldemort and his Death Eaters are up for conjecture. It's incredible how short a time must pass before a certain kind of mentality feels it is safe to turn history onto its head. The progressive element here knows they need to be very careful, Harry said in a low voice. Enough people are still alive who have first-hand memories of Voldemort and his atrocities. Enough people still remember lost family and friends killed at the hand of his Death Eaters. Still, the lure to challenge the status quo, whatever it may be, is strong in the young. It's natural, but typically short-lived. History will out, as they say. History is bunk, Franklin said disgustedly. I should know. I lived during quite a bit of it, and I can indeed tell you that sometimes there is, in fact, a wide gulf between what gets reported and what actually happened. I would expect that is the exception and not the rule, Harry stated. Franklin sighed as they turned a corner. I suppose. The fact is, though, that the exceptions give rabble-rousers like the progressive element all the ammunition they need to challenge any historical record they wish. The history of Voldemort and his rise to power, as we know it, doesn't fit their agenda. Thus they carefully attack it, sowing the seeds of doubt among minds shallow enough to believe the distortions. It sounds, Harry said, keeping his voice low and conversational, like you have a pretty good idea what their agenda is. Of course I do, and so do you, Mr. Potter. The agenda hasn't changed for 1,000 years, has it? No, it hasn't. Harry Potter. Franklin stopped in the darkness of the corridor, studying Harry's face. Even now, a sizable minority in my country believe that Lord Tom Riddle, as they prefer to call him, has been unfairly demonized by you who defeated him. They prefer to believe that Voldemort was a revolutionary hero, a fresh thinker, whose beliefs are simply too much for the traditional ruling class to tolerate. They think he was destroyed because he threatened to make things better, not worse, but that the wealthy and powerful were resistant, even to a change for the good. James, standing several feet away, hidden under the cloak, could see his dad's jaw clenching as Franklin spoke. But when Harry responded, his voice remained calm and measured. You know that these are lies and distortions, I assume. Of course I do, Franklin said, waving a hand dismissively, almost angrily. But the point is that they are attractive lies to a certain type of person. Those that preach those distortions know how to appeal to the emotions of the populace. They believe that truth is a wire to bend to their will. It is their agenda only that they care for. Harry remained stoic and unmoving. And the agenda, you believe, is the domination of the Muggle world? Franklin laughed rather harshly, and James thought of the nasty chuckle the professor had made during dinner when discussing Madame Delacroix's powers. Not to hear them tell it. No, they are crafty these days. They claim to be for the exact opposite. Their rallying cry is the absolute equality between Muggle and magical world. Full disclosure, the abolition of all laws of secrecy and non-competition. They preach that anything less is unfair to the Muggles, an insult to them. Harry nodded grimly, as we are seeing here. Of course, it is a two-edged sword. Prejudice and equality in the same message. Certainly, Franklin agreed, resuming his walk along the corridor. In America, we are seeing a resurgence of stories about Muggle scientists capturing wizards and capturing witches and wizards, torturing them to discover the secret of their magic. A throwback to the old Salem witch trials, Harry asked. Franklin laughed, and this time there was no malice in it. Hardly. Those were the good old days. Sure, witches were put on trial and loads of them were burned, but as you know, any witch worth her wand wouldn't be hurt by a Muggle bonfire. She'd stand in the flames and yell for a while, just to give the Muggles a good show, then transport herself from the pyre flames to her own fireplace. That was the origin of Floo Powder Network. That was the origin of the Floo Network, of course. No, these days, the stories of witches and wizards being captured and systematically tortured are pure fabrications. That doesn't matter to the faithful, though. The culture of fear and prejudice works side by side with their mission of equality. Full disclosure, they claim, will bring peace and freedom. Continuing the program of secrecy, on the other hand, can only lead to more attacks on wizarding society by an increasingly invasive Muggle world. Harry stopped by a window. And once they've achieved their goal of total disclosure within the Muggle world? Well, there's only one outcome to that, isn't there? Franklin answered. Harry's face was thoughtful in the moonlight. Muggles and wizards would descend into competitions and jealousies, just like they did in eons past. The dark wizards would make sure of it. It would start as small challenges and outbursts. Laws would be passed, enforcing equal treatment, but those laws would become the basis for new contentions. Wizards would demand to be placed into Muggle power structures, all in the name of equality. Once there, they'd push for greater control, more power. They'd win over Muggle leaders, and using promises and lies where they could, threats and the Imperious Curse where they couldn't. Eventually, order would break down. Finally, inevitably, there would be all-out war. Harry's voice had gone soft, considering. He turned to Franklin, who stood watching him, his face calm but dreadful. And that's what they want, isn't it? A war with the Muggle world. That's what they've always wanted, Franklin agreed. The struggle never stops. It just has different chapters. Who's involved? Harry asked simply. Franklin sighed again, hugely, and rubbed his eyes. It's not so simple. It's virtually impossible to tell the instigators from their followers. There are some individuals it would be instructive to watch closely, though. Madame Delacroix? Franklin glanced up, studying Harry's face. He nodded. And Professor Jackson. James gasped and then clapped his hand over his mouth. His dad and Professor Franklin stood very still. James was sure they'd heard him. Then Harry spoke again. Anyone else? Franklin shook his head slowly. Of course, but then you'd just be watching everyone and everything. It's like an infestation of cockroaches in the walls. You can either watch the cracks or burn down the house. Take your pick. James backed away very carefully. Then, when he felt safely out of earshot, he turned and retraced his steps back to the Americans' quarters. His heart was pounding so heavily he had been sure that his dad or Professor Franklin would hear it. He knew the so-called progressive element was no good, but now he knew it must be them that were planning the return of Merlinus Ambrosius, believing he would help them to accomplish their false goal of equality, which would lead inevitably to war. Merlin had said that he would return when the balance between Muggles and wizards was ripe for his ministrations. What else could that mean? He hadn't been surprised that Madame Delacroix might be involved in such a plot, but Professor Jackson? James had come to quite like the professor, despite his crusty exterior. He could hardly imagine that Jackson could be secretly plotting the domination of the Muggle world. Franklin had to be wrong about him. James ran lightly past the Americans' quarters, looking for the door to the guest room he and his dad were staying in. With a sudden stab of fear, he remembered that the doorway had vanished when he'd come out. It was a magical room, after all. How was he supposed to get back in? He had to be inside the room, apparently, asleep by the time his dad came back. He stopped in the corridor, not even sure what stretch of wall the doorway had appeared in. He glanced around hopelessly, unable to keep himself from looking for some subtle clue or hint of where the doorway was hidden. What had his dad called it? The room of requirement? James had remembered his wand this time. He pulled it out and shook his hand out from under the cloak, revealing it. He began, whispering harshly and pointing his wand at the wall. Room of requirement. Open? Nothing happened, of course. And then James heard a noise. His senses had grown almost painfully sharp as his body shot full of adrenaline. He listened, his eyes wide. Voices. Franklin and his dad were coming back already. They must have begun their return journey at almost exactly the same time as James, but a little slower. He heard them talking in hushed voices, probably as they stood by the door into Franklin's rooms. His dad would be returning in mere moments. James thought furiously. What had his dad done to open the room? He had just stood there, hadn't he? Waiting, and then bang, there was the door? No, James recalled. He had spoken first, and paced a bit. James replayed the evening in his memory, trying to remember what his dad had said, but he was too flustered. Light bloomed at the end of the corridor. Footsteps approached. James looked down the corridor frantically. His dad was approaching, wand lit but held low, his head down. James remembered that he had his own wand held out, his arm outside the cloak. He yanked it in as quickly and quietly as he could, arranging the cloak to cover himself completely. It was hopeless. His dad would enter the room and see that James wasn't there. Maybe James could follow him in and claim to have been to his rooms to get a book he needed. He had never been any good at lying. Besides, he'd had the cloak with him. He almost groaned out loud. Harry Potter stopped in the corridor. He held the wand up and looked at the wall. I need to get into the room my son is sleeping in, he said conversationally. Nothing happened. Harry didn't seem surprised. He said, apparently to himself. I wonder why the door won't open. I suppose... He looked around, raising his eyebrows and smiling very slightly. It's because my son isn't sleeping in the room of requirement at all, but is standing here in the corridor with me, under my invisibility cloak, trying as hard as he can to remember how in the world to open the door. Right, James? James let out his breath and yanked the invisibility cloak off. You knew all along, didn't you? I assumed it when I heard you gasp downstairs. I didn't know for sure until the trick with the door. Come on, let's get inside. Harry Potter chuckled tiredly. He paced 3 times and spoke the words that opened the room of requirement, and they were in. When they were both in their beds, James in the top bunk, staring up at the dark ceiling, Harry spoke. You don't have to follow in my footsteps, James. I hope you know that. James worked his jaw, not ready to respond to that. He listened and waited. You're right. You were down there tonight, so you heard... Oh, hold on. Rewind. You were down there tonight, so you heard Professor Franklin, Harry finally said. There's one part of what he said that I want you to remember. There are always plots and revolutions in the works. The battle is always the same, just with different chapters. It isn't your job to save the world, son. Even if you do, it'll just go and get itself into danger again and again and again. It's the nature of things. Harry paused, and James heard him laugh quietly. I know how it feels. I remember the great weight of responsibility and the heady thrill of believing I was the only one to stop the evil, to win the war, to battle for the ultimate good. But James, even then, that wasn't my duty alone. It was everyone's fight, everyone's sacrifice. And there were those whose sacrifice was far greater than my own. It isn't one man's duty to save the world. And it certainly isn't the duty of one boy who can't even figure out how to open the room of requirement yet. James heard movement from the bunk below. His dad stood, his head rising to look at James in the top bunk. In the darkness, James couldn't make out his expression, but he knew it nonetheless. His dad was smiling his crooked, knowing smile. His dad knew it all. His dad was Harry Potter. What do you think, son? James took a deep breath. He wanted to tell his dad about everything he'd seen and heard. It was on the tip of his tongue to tell him about the Muggle intruder and Cedric Diggory's ghost and the secret of Astromatics, the plot to return Merlin and use him to start a final war with the Muggles. But in the end, he decided not to. He smiled at his dad. I know, Dad. Don't worry about me. If I decide to save the world single-handedly, I'll send you and Mom a note first, okay? Harry smirked and shook his head, not really buying it, but knowing there was no point in pressing the point. He climbed back into the bottom bunk. 5 minutes later, James spoke up in the dark. Hey, Dad, any chance you might let me keep the invisibility cloak with me for the school year? None at all, my boy. None at all, Harry said sleepily. James heard him roll over. A few minutes later, both slept. No chance.
Well, it's worth a shot.
Yeah, no chance in Azkaban.
I'd just like to point out to Harry that he didn't figure out how to get into the room of requirement until his 5th year, and even then, someone else told him how to do it.
Exactly. So in the movies, I think Neville figures it out, but I think in the books, isn't it Dobby?
Dobby tells him about it, yeah. Because that's where he sends Winky when she's too drunk.
Yeah, exactly. But they call it the come and go room.
The come and go room, yeah. Dumbledore mentions it briefly in
room full of chamber pots.
Yeah, room full of chamber pots. I guess imagine him walking down, gotta pee.
Right. If you walk back and forth enough times, yeah. Although if he had to go that bad, I wonder why he walked in circles, but you know. Do you want to read the next section?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I guess we can read again.
Okay. When James and Harry Potter entered the Great Hall the next morning, James sensed the mood of the room change. He was used to the reaction that the wizarding community showed whenever he was out with his dad, but this was different. Rather than turning to look at them, James sensed people looking pointedly in the other direction. Conversations quieted. There was a strange sensation of people glancing at them sideways, or turning to watch once James and Harry had passed them. James felt a surge of anger. Who were these people? Most of them were good witches and wizards from hard-working parents who had always been supportive of Harry Potter. First as the boy who lived, then as the young man who helped bring down the downfall of Voldemort, and finally as the man who was head Auror. Now, just because some rabble-rousers had painted a few signs and spread around a few stupid rumors, they were afraid to look directly at him. Even as James thought that, however, he saw that he was wrong. As Harry and James sat down at the end of the Gryffindor table, James had pleaded with his dad not to make him sit up at the teacher's table on the dais. There were a few grins and hearty greetings. Ted saw Harry, whooped, and ran down the length of the table, giving Harry a complicated handshake that involved a lot of banging fists, hand grips, and finally an embrace that was one part hug and one part body slam.
I feel like it's what Sirius and Harry could have been.
Yeah,
Is
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I wonder if James ever felt jealous of the relationship between Ted and Harry.
That's a good question because that was technically his first son at what 18 years old whenever Tongson what's her name? I mean Tongson died in the battle.
Technically his actual name isn't Ted.
It's true. It's
Edward.
Edward? Remus Edward Lupin the second?
No.
No. I thought he was named after his grandfather, and his grandfather is called Ted, right?
Yeah, but it's Edward Edward Remus Lupin.
Okay.
Occasionally known as Ted. He gets the nickname from his grandfather on his mother's side, whose name was known as Ted Tonks.
Gotcha. I've never thought of Ted as short for Edward, but I guess it works. Kind of like Robert and Bob. Just random change in a letter here or there. But yeah, I love the realizing. I think I saw a meme one time that had a picture of like an illustration of Harry laying in the bed with little baby Ted, like as his godfather, and he was just like babysitting him or whatever. And it's like, yeah, he was a godfather who, I don't know what you call it when your godfatherness becomes legitimate, when the parents are gone. But he, I mean, at least the grandmother was still alive to raise him.
Yeah. I think he sort of like bounced between them a bit because, Harry being only 17 at the time, not really in a position to raise a baby on his own.
Right.
So obviously the maternal grandmother being there to raise him and all that. So
right. It's crazy. So I love that they have a special handshake. It makes so much sense.
Harry collapsed onto the bench, laughing. Ted, you're going to knock yourself clean out one of these times. My godfather, everybody, Ted said, as if introducing Harry to the room at large. Have you met Noah yet, Harry? He's a gremlin like me, and Petra. Harry shook Noah's hand. I think we met last year at the Quidditch Championship, yes? Sure, Noah said. That was the game where Ted scored the winning point for the opposing team. How could I forget? Technically, it was an assist, Ted said primly. I happened to wallop their team's quaffle carrier through the goal on accident. I was aiming for the press box. Hate to interrupt, but do you guys mind if James and I get a little breakfast? Harry asked, gesturing toward the table. Have at it, Ted replied magnanimously. And if any of these malcontents gives you any trouble, just let me know. It's Quidditch tonight, and we hold grudges. He eyed the room grimly, then grinned and sauntered away. I'd tell him not to sweat it, but that'd be taking away his fun, wouldn't it? Harry said, watching Ted depart. James grinned. They both began to fill their plates from the steaming platters along the table, and they began to eat. As they began to eat, James was pleased to see Ralph and Zane enter. He waved them over enthusiastically. Hey, Dad, here's my friend, Zane and Ralph, James said as they piled onto the benches, one on either side. Zane's the blonde one, Ralph's the brick house. Pleased to meet you, Zane, Ralph, Harry said. James tells me good things about both of you. I've read about you. Ralph said, staring at Harry. Did you really do all that stuff? Harry laughed. Straight shooter, isn't he? He said, raising an eyebrow at James. The major points, yes, those are probably true. Although if you'd have been there, it would have seemed a lot less heroic at the time. Mostly, me and my friends were just trying to keep ourselves from getting blasted, eaten, or cursed. Zane seemed unenthusiastically quiet. Hey, what's the deal? James said, nudging him. You're a little too new to all this to have an idol complex about the great Harry Potter. Zane grimaced and then pulled a copy of the Daily Prophet from his backpack. This stinks, he said, sighing and flopping the paper open onto the table. But you're gonna see it sooner or later. James leaned over and glanced at it. Hogwarts anti-aura demonstration overshadows International Summit. The main headline read. Below it, in smaller type, Potter visit set of school-wide protest as magical community re-evaluates aura policies. James felt his cheeks flush red with anger. Before he could respond, however, his dad placed a hand on his shoulder. Harry said mildly. That's got Rita Skeeter's name all over it. Zane frowned at Harry and glanced at the paper again. You can tell who wrote it just by the headline? No. Harry laughed, dismissing the newspaper and digging into a slice of French toast. Her name's on the byline. Still, yeah, that's pretty much her typical brand of tripe. It hardly matters. The word will forget it by this time next week.
I feel like I should have an emoji of a beetle on the screen during this story.
James was reading the first paragraph, his brow furrowing furiously. She says that most of the school was there, protesting and shouting. That's complete rubbish. I saw it. And if there were more than 100 people there, I'll kiss a blast-ended screw. Besides, most of them were just there to see what was going on. There were only 15 or 20 people with the signs and the slogans. Harry sighed. It's just a story, James. It isn't supposed to be accurate. It's supposed to sell papers. But how can you let them say things like that? It's dangerous. Professor Franklin, the look Harry gave him stopped him from going any further. After a second, Harry's expression softened. I know what you're worried about, James, and I don't blame you. But there are ways of handling these things, and one of those ways isn't arguing with people like Rita Skeeter. You sound like McGonagall, James said, dropping his eyes and jabbing at a chunk of sausage. I should, Harry replied quickly. She taught me, and I think it's Headmistress McGonagall to you. James poked at his plate sullenly for a moment. Then, not wanting to look at it any more, he folded the newspaper roughly and stuck it out of sight. First Quidditch of the season tonight, then, right? Harry asked, waving his fork at the three boys in general. Ravenclaw versus Gryffindor, Zane announced. My first game. I can hardly wait. James looked up and saw his dad grinning at Zane. You made the Ravenclaw team. That's very cool. If I can finish early enough, I plan on coming to the match. I look forward to seeing you fly. What position will you play? Beater, Zane said, pretending to swat a bludger with his fork. He's pretty good, Mr. Potter, Ralph said earnestly. I saw him fly his first time. He just about made a crater in the middle of the pitch. But he pulled up just at the last second. That takes some serious control. Harry acknowledged, studying Zane. You've had broom lessons? Not a one, Ralph cried, as if he were Zane's public relations agent. That's the amazing bit, isn't it? James looked at Ralph, his face grim, trying to catch his eye and warn him off the topic, but it was already too late. He probably wouldn't have figured it out at all, Ralph said, if he hadn't taken off after James when he did the big out of control like a bottle rocket rumba. Ralph squirmed on the bench, mimicking James's inaugural broom fright. But you'll be supporting the Gryffindors, of course, Zane interrupted suddenly, planting his palm on Ralph's forehead and pushing him backwards. Harry glanced around the table, chewing a chunk of toast, quizzical look on his face. Well, yes, of course, he admitted, still looking from boy to boy. Yeah, well, that's cool. I understand completely, Zane said quickly, waggling his eyebrows at Ralph, He was sitting there looking nonplussed. Be
Oh,
true to your school and all that. Look at the time. Come on, Ralph, Netta. Classes to get to. I have a free period first, Ralph protested, and I haven't had any breakfast yet. Let's go, you lunkhead, Zane insisted, coming around the table and hooking Ralph's elbow. Zane could barely move Ralph, but Ralph allowed himself to be tugged along. What? Ralph said loudly, frowning at the meaningful look Zane was giving him. What did I do? Did I say something I wasn't? He stopped. His eyebrows shot up and turned back to James, looking mortified. Oh, uh, he said as Zane pulled him towards the door. As they rounded the corner, James heard Ralph say, I'm just a big idiot, aren't I? James sighed. So, yeah, I stink at Quidditch. I'm sorry. Harry studied his son. Pretty bad, was it? James nodded. I know, he said. It's no big deal. It's just Quidditch. There's always next year. I don't have to do it just because you did it. I know. I know. You don't have to say it. Harry continued to stare at James, his jaw moving slightly as if he was thinking. Finally, he sat back and picked up his pumpkin juice. Well, that's a load off my chest then. Sounds like you've done my job for me. Uh, James looked up at his dad. Harry looked back at him as he took a very long, slow drink from his glass. He seemed to be smiling and hiding himself behind the glass. James tried not to laugh. This is serious, he told himself. This isn't funny. This is Quidditch. On that thought, his composure cracked slightly. He smiled and then tried to cover it with his hand, which only made it worse. Harry lowered his glass and grinned, shaking his head slowly. You've really been worried about this, haven't you, James? James's smile faltered again, and he swallowed. Yeah, Dad, of course I have. I mean, it's Quidditch. It's your sport. And Granddad's too. If James Potter, I'm James Potter. I'm supposed to be excellent on a broom, not a danger to myself and everybody around me. Harry leaned forward, putting his glass down and looking James in the eye. And you still may be great on the broom, James. Merlin's beard, son. It's your first week, and you've not even had your first broom lesson, have you? Back when I started here, you wouldn't even be allowed to get on a practice broom without lessons, much less try out for the house teams. But even
yeah.
if you had,
I was just gonna say it's weird that they have to get licenses to ride brooms now, but at school they can try out for the team where you're on a broom without having a lesson. I'm like, double standards much?
I I have a feeling that the license isn't so much to prove that you know how to fly a broom. It's so that if you get caught breaking any rules, like flying where you're not supposed to be, they can track you.
Oh, yeah, that's
Maybe, possibly. Obviously, you need to get taught how to fly. You got all right, here's a broom, off you go.
right.
But yeah, I have a feeling that with the Muggle and magical worlds being closer than ever, thanks to Muggle technology, I think it's getting a little bit harder to find safe places to be a wizard and do wizard things.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I think if I was Hermione, or in this case Rose, when I got there, instead of like SPW, I'd be like, we need to make it more fair in the Quidditch tryouts where you have to have had a broom lesson before you can try out. I need to push the tryouts out 2 weeks.
Yeah, yeah. Tryouts not before first lessons.
Yes, that is
That would make sense. Maybe even
my.
have like a junior league and a senior league.
Hey, see, we've got a thing going here. We're gonna figure this out. We just have to come up with a good acronym. That's just as bad as spew. Oh, speaking of, I saw another picture and it said somebody said Society for the oh no, Society for the Progression of Elfish Welfare on one side, and then somebody was going like this, and then on the other side he was like this, and it said Dobby Lobby.
Lobby lobby.
Yeah, that's the new name. Okay, so sorry to interrupt. Uh, so yeah, and go.
Okay. Um, Back when I started here, we wouldn't have been allowed to get on a practice broom without lessons, much less try out for the house teams. But even if you had, James interrupted, you'd have been excellent at it. That's not the point, son. You're so worried about living up to the myth of who I was supposed to be that you aren't giving yourself a chance to be even better. You're defeating yourself before you've even start. Before you even start. Don't you see that? No one can compete with a legend. Even I wish I was half the wizard the stories make me out to be. Every day I look in the mirror and tell myself not to try so hard to be the famous Harry Potter, but just to relax and let myself be your dad and your mum's husband and the best aura I can be, which sometimes doesn't seem to be all that great, to tell you the truth. You have to stop thinking of yourself as the son of Harry Potter. Harry paused, seeing that James had really heard him, perhaps for the first time. He smiled a little again, and gave me the chance to think of myself simply as James Potter's dad instead. Because of all the things I've done in my life, raising you, Albus, and Lily are the three things I'm proudest of. Got it? James smiled again, crookedly. He didn't know it, but it was the same crooked smile he so often saw on his dad's face. All right, Dad, I'll try that, but it's hard. Harry nodded understandingly and sat back. After a moment, he said, I am always, am I always that predictable? James broke into a knowing grin. Sure, Dad. You and Mum both. You aren't going outside wearing that, are you? Harry laughed out loud at James's impression of Ginny. James went on. It's cold in here. Put on a sweater. Don't say that word in front of your grandmum. Stop playing with the garden gnomes, or you'll get green thumbs. Harry was still laughing and wiping his eyes as they said goodbye, promising to meet him that evening at the Quidditch.
I love that. I love that. I know that this chapter is like it's very political and it's like we've had the first five chapters to meet Zane and Ralph and meet James and have the adventures, building up. But at this point, it's like we have to recognize, the seriousness of what's actually going on at the school too, and what's going on in the world.
Mm.
I do like that. Right here it says when Harry says, "I look in the mirror and tell myself not to try so hard to be the famous Harry Potter." I wish I was half the wizard the stories make me out to be. That part. I was thinking about how I've heard it said, I want to be the person that my dog thinks I am. Like, always happy to see you, always excited. You're just an amazing, you're amazing. And I thought, what if I imagine Harry being like, I want to be the person that Dobby thinks I am.
Yes.
Harry Potter. Love it.
Yes.
Long live Dobby in our hearts.
Mm. Dobby is free.
Dobby is free. Oh my gosh, did they put that on the tombstone like a free elf?
Here lies Dobby, a free elf.
Yep. He's free.
Speaking of spew, I think Hermione's job was successful because earlier
Yes.
in the book, Ralph mentions that he read about house elves okay, finally they get a mention. So
Yes. And I think a lot of people might be bothered by the fact that if you come out early enough, you'll see them working and things. But to me, that's another success of spew. It's like, it's not like they're so hidden as to pretend that they don't exist.
yeah,
It's like they're
I
clearly.
agree. I've had discussions about these books with people online, and one of the things that they always point out is that how things are different in the first book, which there are some differences. But one of them was like, I don't like how now house elves are seen everywhere. They're supposed to be behind the scenes, unseen, unnoticed. And I'm thinking to myself, but we, the reader, are now from the Harry Potter books, we're more informed. So are we more inclined to notice these things?
Hmm.
Like, when you go somewhere and you don't see anything, when then someone points out something and now you can never unsee it. You always notice it now.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
we the reader know that there's house elves at the school. So having James notice little things like that, I think it just shows that, we as the reader have progressed and more knowledgeable.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And he knows about them as well, and Harry didn't.
And Harry's just he never notices anything though. He's dumb.
Yeah. Yeah. He didn't notice things like that. But what I think too, they actually come out to the point where James actually sees them, and I know Zane tries to tip one of them at one
Mm,
point, give him a $5 bill or something.
yeah.
But yeah, I agree. We're more aware of them, and also you think about like I always equate the stories that I read, the fiction, with real life, and it's like, okay, if there's someone who is cleaning up after your table, serving your food, and they're always hidden, or in our case, standing against the walls while you're eating and just
Yeah.
there whenever you need something, like that's not okay. Like that's we know as humans that that's not a good thing. And now looking at this, it's like, okay, I understand that they want to serve, in some cases, but that's not, you got to, I agree with Hermione. I'm with Spew all the way. Like I would totally wear the sticker and everything. But it's like the promotion, that's it, the promotion of elfish welfare. Uh,
Mm.
yeah,
You have to like, yeah, I agree, but at the same time, if like there's a whole race of people that for magical beings, who, as far as we know, have always been in the role of being in service to others. If taking that one thing that they have that they cherish away from them hurts them more than letting them do the thing that makes them happy.
yeah,
Where do you put, if you change their entire society to something that they are not used to and to something that they no longer recognize, how much more danger is that going to cause? How much more harm is that going to cause them?
yeah,
Like
that's
if,
true.
like,
You have to realize they're not human too. I mean,
yeah,
they are intelligent, but they're not human, and so you can't make a direct comparison there. And
like have has the house elves always been in service to other, I don't want to sound reduced, but quote unquote superior beings, or were they thousands of years ago actually enslaved and turned into what they are?
right, how did that come to be? And actually, if you read or listen to the YouTube reading on this channel of of Merlin's gift, it
Mm.
talks about their history and why they are subservient. So
I need to reread that. I
yeah,
read those books.
yeah, you'll have to check it out again because it actually tells why they are the way they are. And so yeah, definitely something to check into, and it tells why they want to serve. But I don't want to give spoilers on here. So
No, no, definitely. No spoilers. Link in the description. Click
absolutely.
it. Trying to think where else there.
Ooh. So I just want to say the next chapter that we're going into is called Broken Loyalty. And the
Mm,
picture is a badge that says question the victors. So interesting to
yes,
see how that goes.
yes,
But I
it
really
is.
like the balance. I feel like George really balances the politics and the adult talk with the adventure and the fun and the comedy, especially with that Zane brings into the picture.
Oh, absolutely. I love Zane. Zane's a great character.
Yeah, he really is. I love that he's goofy and silly, but at the same time, he's the one that saw the newspaper article. He pays attention to stuff like that.
He's a
All the
lot
while
smarter than people give him credit for.
Yeah. Yeah. And
No,
Ralph,
no spoilers.
yeah, no spoilers. Yeah. And Ralph is so funny to me because like he's so impulsive, but at the same time he's thoughtful. But it's like he doesn't think about things like the way the conversation was going with the whole Quidditch, oh yeah, James like went crazy on his broom and like he doesn't even realize his dad doesn't know this yet and maybe he shouldn't talk about it. And then Zane being his good American self and be like, all right, lunkhead, come on, let's get out of here and let them talk. So, but I like how that turned out, how James was like, yeah, so I'm not great at Quidditch. That's all he had to say.
Yeah.
He's already told it. And then they just start laughing about it. It was great. I love it.
It's James does have a characteristic of Harry when he's not telling everything that he probably should.
Yes, it's like all of this list of things that he could tell the head horror. And he's like, nah.
I'll just keep it to myself for now.
Yeah. As Zane puts it, the head of the wizard cops, the chief of the wizard cops.
The chief of the wizard cops?
Yeah. The chief of the wizard cops, he doesn't need to know all these, things that are happening.
No, not at all. Not at all.
That would be the end of the story. That would be boring.
It would be.
Oh my goodness. Well, we need to figure out what our first action will be as part of our society for making sure that students can do Quidditch tryouts after their first broom lesson.
Speak to McGonagall, I suppose. I wonder what happened to Madam Hooch.
I know. I need a life story of Madam Hooch. I need like her whole life story.
Yeah. No.
We don't get enough.
Was she like a former Quidditch pro who retired and is now teaching, or is she the type who had wasn't quite good enough to go pro, so she just became a teacher? Couldn't do, so she taught.
Oh, that's terrible. That's actually another quote. It's a quoted quote, but it's also in Merlin's gift. Those who can do, and those who cannot. And Hufflepuff says, "Oh, please don't say it." So yeah, it sounds like you have an action coming out of this meeting to go and listen to Merlin's.
Yes, absolutely.
Merlin's gift again.
Yes, I'll definitely bring that up on my phone and listen to that while I'm pottering around the place.
No, pottering around. All right, let's go pottering around.
Yeah, absolutely. What's the time? It's almost 12 o'clock for me.
PM. Yes. 12 p.m. And it is almost 7:30 p.m. Hey, we're both in the PM at least.
We're both in PM, but I'm in the PM of the next day.
You are. That's so crazy. It's so weird.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, I guess I better head to bed-ish.
Yeah. I've got work in a few hours myself.
Aw.
Need to have some lunch first, though.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. All right. See you later. Bye-bye. Take care.
Jess.
Bye, Jess.